so much for inviting me to speak at Convocation. It's truly an honor to all the faculty who have been so gracious and all the students that I've met over the last day and a half. It's been just so exciting. I love being on college campuses. It's just the energy, just the enthusiasm, and the questions that have, on some level, even challenged me to think differently about the work that I do, and just posing questions that have made me think a little bit about, things we might tweak here and there with the work that we're doing with the Expectations Project and working with communities of faith around public education. So it's just been wonderful. The one downside is no one told me it was going to be like 3 degrees when I came here. I would have come anyway, but it's just, I'm just saying next time, let's do it in the spring. So I want to talk just this morning for a bit about public education in America. And I'm going to tell a little bit of my story, bits and pieces some of you may have heard, but want to open with that because for me it really does frame why this issue is so important. And then we'll get into some more of the specifics and talk about a biblical framework for why I believe this is one of our country's biggest justice issues, and really looking to people in your generation and others to really take up this mantle and make sure that we're the generation where this is the time where we eliminate this massive injustice in our country. So as was noted in my bio, I grew up in Detroit, and I'm a very proud graduate of a Detroit public high school. And the sad news is, though, that for most kids who graduate from public schools in Detroit, as you might have guessed or heard, most students don't go on to college. I was fortunate to get accepted into an exam public high school, Renaissance High School. So you have to take a test to get in, and so as a result, they're really looking for students that the school district deem have some academic potential. So my school was amazing. Again, contrary to what people might think about Detroit public schools, my school was phenomenal. We had AP classes in every subject. We were required to take Latin, and my senior year I took AP microbiology. I mean, who does that in high school? So I mean, it was just this amazing experience. And the big contrast was, though, that while my school was preparing me for college, from the very first day I entered in September, it was just not, are you going? It's, where are you going? Let's get you ready. All of my friends in my neighborhood attended Cooley High School, which was the neighborhood high school where the boundaries dictated you go unless you got into one of these other, couple of exam or magnet schools in Detroit. And they had a completely different experience. About half of those kids dropped out of high school before they graduated. No one talked to my friends at Cooley High School about college. I had friends who did not hear one word about college. The expectation for them was that they weren't going, so as a result, no one talked to them about it. And the challenge for me was, as I realized, my very best friends in the neighborhood, got to their senior year and had never heard of anything like an SAT or an ACT. They just weren't on the same track, and for me it was hard because these were my besties. Like, I knew that they were incredibly smart, curious, witty, but no one assumed that they were going. And so why did I get this education at again, a Detroit public high school where everyone assumed I was going and assumed the best about my abilities and set very high standards for me, but my friends weren't getting the same? And not surprisingly, the only people that I know in my entire neighborhood that went to college is myself, my brother who went to the same exam school, and one young lady who went to a private school in the suburbs who lived across the street from us. No one else I know went to college. And when you think about just the generations of kids that, in my opinion, are getting left behind, it's just truly devastating. So when I went to college, I ended up joining Teach for America, much to my parents' shock and somewhat chagrin, I think. I moved, oops. Okay, that was just an earring. We can keep going. Wondered what it was. Much to my parents' shock and chagrin, I packed up my light blue Nissan Sentra, my little bucket car, and moved across the country to teach in Compton, California. I think I even surprised myself because honestly at that time, all that Compton was really known for was, at the time, I'm dating myself a little bit, but gangster rap, NWA. That's sort of their biggest claim to fame, so it wasn't exactly sort of a ringing endorsement for the community that I would come to really love and feel like was home for me. But nonetheless, I moved out there, and so I'm getting ready for my class a few days before school starts, and like most new teachers, I'm making sure the bulletin boards are perfect, and all the charts are on the wall, and the pictures with the fall leaves are welcoming my kids at the door. And I remember one of the veteran teachers came by, and she just looked at me and she said, "Oh, you're Miss Baker?" And I said, yes, ma'am, I am. And she said, "You're teaching this class of 5th graders?" And I was like, "Yes." And she was like, "Are you sure you aren't in 5th grade? You look like you're about 10 or 11 yourself." And I was like, "Well, thanks so much. That's awesome vote of confidence." And she said it jokingly, but there was definitely some seriousness behind it because, I was 22, fresh out of college, bright-eyed and eager, and I think from her perspective, like, this is gonna be way harder than you think, little girl. Fast forward, a couple of days, when my students came in that first day, I just looked at them and saw all these incredibly bright-eyed, 27 pairs of eyes that, were smiling and excited to see their friends on the first day of school, and, had heard that they had a new young teacher, so I think they were trying to size me up and figure out, like, oh, she looks like she's gonna be fun, and I was very excited about what was gonna happen that year. So again, fast forward again, about a week and a half later, I had done what all, they tell all first-year teachers or new teachers to do with any group of kids, is you do some diagnostic tests to figure out, where are my kids' reading levels, where are their math levels. When I got those test results back, I was devastated. I knew that the achievement gap existed. Again, I saw it growing up in Detroit. That's why I chose to do Teach for America. But to get data back about my 27 fifth graders and see that 2/3 of them were doing reading and math at a second grade level or below in fifth grade, I had 5 or 6 students that were functionally illiterate in the 5th grade. They literally didn't know the phonics that go along with letters, so they couldn't actually sound out words phonetically in the 5th grade. That was just such a shock to me, because it wasn't just me reading about it in a book. It was looking at the faces of my babies and realizing that they had been educated for, this was their fifth year in school. They're in 5th grade, but somehow they had gotten to this point and they didn't have the basic skills that kids are supposed to learn in 1st and 2nd grade. And so I had to take that in, and to be honest, like, I went home that night and I just cried. I cried not because, well, partly because I was scared out of my mind. I was like, what am I gonna do? That was part of it, but it was also, I cried because I realized that somehow, someone, the system, whatever you want to call it, had let my kids get passed on year after year, and some of them did not know how to read. And no one seemed to do anything about it, because here they were in 5th grade showing up for school, and they hadn't learned. We had let this go on. Why had this happened? So that's my introduction into education, and it's what's fueled my passion for many years after that, and it's why I focus on this issue today. And we're going to get into a little bit more of the specifics in a moment. So I want to frame this because I think it's important for us to recognize the context that we're talking about. I would love to say that my group of students in Compton and my experience in Detroit is incredibly unique, and that there aren't academic disparities all across the country. It's just simply not the case. Right now, there are 15 million kids growing up in the United States who are living in poverty, and there are millions more whose families are right above the poverty line, but are still in schools that are full of challenges. And as a nation, I think we need to look at ourselves and say, what is our responsibility for some of the most disenfranchised kids in our country, and what do we believe they deserve? What do we believe they can actually accomplish? And those are, I think, the pressing questions that we need to wrestle with. So I'm going to ask you all to indulge me. I'd like everyone to stand up for a moment. I promise we're not going to do jumping jacks or anything. Don't worry. All right. In the balcony, standing up. Okay. I would like everyone straight down the middle to this side to sit down. So this side, sit down. Everyone over here, stay standing. Okay. So look around and see who's up. So if you are a student who's growing up in poverty and attending a public school, all of you that were standing started out in kindergarten together. By the time you get to 12th grade, this is who's left. Half of the kids, by the time they get to 12th grade in low-income communities, have dropped out of high school. So all of the rest of you have found other things to do. You've gotten lost somewhere along the way. You've chosen to leave school. School has chosen to ask you to leave. But the bottom line is half of you are gone. You guys can sit down, you lucky ones who made it to high school. I do that because I think the visual for me is always a bit jarring to realize, as a teacher, for me, teaching in Compton, I had to look at my 27 kids and realize how far behind they were, and if I didn't find a way to get them caught up, 13 of them were probably not going to be there on graduation day when they got to 12th grade. And the statistics get worse, honestly, from high school on. Not surprisingly, if only half of the kids growing up in poor communities are graduating from high school, most of them aren't getting to college. And that statistic behind me that says 1 in 10, that's the number of kids from low-income communities that end up graduating from college. And, you know, there's lots of discussion, I think, in our country right now. Is college for everyone? Should that be the goal? My suggestion and strong feeling is that it may not be the goal for everyone, but we shouldn't decide systematically, I would argue, who gets the chance to decide if college is for them. So if you're at a school where no one's talking to you about college, that decision is being made for you by lots of other people and not one that you're able to make for yourself. And I think we all recognize the importance of certainly a high school diploma to find a job that's going to be hopefully meaningful, and let alone being able to earn a living for yourself and your family one day. But certainly college is the gatekeeper to so many positions of not just you know, earning a decent living, but really positions that are making crucial decisions. We need everyone in our country to have the potential and opportunity to achieve at the highest of levels, because these are the folks who are going to be making decisions about what happens in our world. It's the people generally with the high school and college diplomas and now graduate diplomas that are making those key decisions. And to have only 10% of kids from poor communities getting there, it's just not okay. The academic achievement gap is not just an issue of class, it's also an issue of race. I would love to say that race and class aren't you know, incredibly linked in our country, but I think we're all pretty aware that they are through lots of historical factors that we have no time to delve into this morning. But the situation suggests that race and class are sort of inextricably linked. And thinking about the achievement gap in terms of race, the statistics behind me, the third row there, have 5 percentages. And those are the percentages of high school graduates by racial groups in the country. And so you look at that, there's massive gaps. The highest percentage of college graduates by race in the US are Asian American students. 93% of Asian American students are graduating from high school on time. 83% of white and Caucasian students. I guess I'll high five, but I'm gonna let that go. Well done, well done. 83% of Caucasian students are graduating from high school in 4 years on time. And then the statistics get dramatically lower for communities of color. 71% of Latino and Hispanic students are graduating from high school on time. You know, the others are not going to make it through. 69% for Native American students, and 66% for African American students, which obviously I'm African American, and for me that just hits home, and it's very painful to see just the disparities between graduation rates. The final statistic is this idea of 3 grade levels, which is sort of a wonky teacher term a little bit, but basically, the devastating truth is that we see the achievement gap starting very, very early for kids. It's not a high school or college graduation rate issue. It starts as early as the 4th grade. And in fact, by the time kids in poor communities are in the 4th grade, on the average, they're already 3 grade levels behind once they get to 4th grade. So a student that should be able to read a Harry Potter book in 4th grade is struggling to read a 1st grade C-spot run kind of book. And, you know, there's lots of factors that have led to this, and we've gotten into several discussions in the classes I've been in, you know, looking at this from, you know, the family's responsibility, the parents' responsibility. Well, what about poverty? If you're struggling to work 2 jobs, are you a parent who has the time and the resources to, you know, go up to school for the parent-teacher conference at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? You know, what about the structure? What about school funding equity? There are a host of reasons that we see the achievement gap existing in our nation. It's going to take a multifaceted approach to really alleviate that. But at this point, I really want to focus a bit more on sort of the biblical framework for why we should be focused on this issue and what it means for us as people of faith to tackle this issue as a justice issue. And I'll probably touch a little bit on some of the causes as we go throughout as well. You know, so the bottom line that I would suggest to us all here is that about 60 years ago, as I'm sure most folks know, schools were desegregated legally through the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board, and my parents were young kids at that time, but they certainly thought, and my grandparents thought that was going to be sort of the end of school inequity once African Americans and Latinos and others could really have access to high-quality schools. But yet and still, we see, you know, school desegregation has not eliminated the achievement gap. really at all. And so, to think that we still have really what people call de facto segregation in public schools, there are actually still two shockingly separate and inherently unequal public school systems. So to illustrate this a bit, I live in DC now. And DC's public schools don't, again, have probably the best reputation. There's always sort of talk every 4 years when a president comes into town with school-age children. Generally, he and his family choose to send, every time, except for, I think, Amy Carter, they've chosen to send their child to a private school. And there's always this sort of, kerfluffle, like, oh, how could they do that? And people then start to look at the public schools in DC, and they're like, oh, I get it now. That's why they sent their kids to a private school. But the fact of the matter is, there are some public schools in Washington, DC that are doing a phenomenal job educating children that any of us would be thrilled to send our kids to. So DC is broken up into quadrants. Anyone from DC area, DMV? A couple hands, okay. So you know that DC is broken up into 4 quadrants by, sort of geographic location. Northwest DC has some phenomenal public schools. So there's a school on the very northwest side of DC where the houses cost at least like $1.5 million to get sort of a 3-bedroom, bungalow, Cape Cod style house. Most houses are $2 and $3 million to purchase. And most of those folks send their kids to public schools at least through elementary school. And one school in particular, you visit this school and it's just like, palatial, like green lawns and just, have, iPads in every class for every kid. And you wonder like, oh, this is a DC public school. The achievement rates are like through the roof. 95% of the kids are achieving like above grade level, just this insane amount. They have school auctions. As a fundraiser, the PTA is very active, and they have school fundraisers, but the things they're auctioning off are, a visit to the West Wing to have lunch with the president. Literally. And someone will pay $10,000 to do that, and the school gets all of this money. A trip to the Bahamas to have someone, stay in someone's summer home. So yay. I say yay for those parents who can raise that kind of money for their schools to supplement what the school budget is. And I would certainly never say, you shouldn't do that because all in for our kids, right? I'm a parent. I believe in doing everything you can for your child's education. However, so that school is incredibly well resourced. With their auction funds, they were able to get computers in every classroom and even fund to have an additional part-time teacher, a volunteer basically all the time, someone who has an actual teaching background in the classes. So kids are having 2 teachers in the class at that school. Get in your car, drive across the bridge, across the Anacostia River into Southeast DC. Very different scenario. Still a public school, but the schools there have, academic achievement rates of literally, 10 to 15% of the kids are reading at grade level. Only 10 to 15% in these schools. There is no PTA that is able to auction off a lunch in the West Wing with the president or the vice president. They just don't have those kinds of resources. And not surprisingly, in order to go to the school on the northwest side, you actually have to live in the boundaries where that school is located. So you have to be able to, of course, afford to buy a house in that neighborhood to live there. And again, I'm not hating on the people that can afford to do that. By all means, work it out for your kids. But that said, if you're living in Southeast DC, your options are neighborhood boundary laden as well. And if you're living in a neighborhood whose school is struggling, that's basically your only option. There is a lottery system in DC. The website for the schools in Northwest DC say, odds of getting, you can apply for the lottery. We rarely have any spots. The odds of getting in are like, 1 in 1,000 or something like that. They're very honest about that because, of course, everyone wants to send their kids to school like that. I use that example to really try to illustrate just the vast disparity with 2 public schools in the same school district. We're not talking about urban and suburban. Those disparities are there as well for different reasons. But even within a school district, these are the inequities that we see existing in our nation's public schools. So that's all the bad news. But the good news is, quite simply, we can change this. It's actually possible to close the academic achievement gap, and I truly believe without a shadow of a doubt that kids from any background can achieve at incredibly, incredibly high levels. And let me tell you why I believe that. So back to my classroom in Compton, after I had my pity party about where my kids were academically, I had to figure out what to do as a first-year teacher. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, how do I get my kids there? Honestly, the first couple months of my classroom, there wasn't a whole lot of learning going on because I was unsure of what to do, feeling hopeless. Is this even possible? And I remember after one particularly challenging morning with my students and feeling like they weren't really learning much and that we weren't going to get to the goals by the end of the year. I had the privilege of, the schools in California are all open courtyard because it's, California, dude, whatever. And so it's very like, open and palm trees outside in the courtyard. And so all the doors are always open. And so because of that, I could always hear the 5th grade teacher next door to me, Mrs. Harrison, who was this incredibly like, well-dressed, like well put together, never a hair out of place, like poised, middle-aged African-American woman who just was one of the best teachers in the school, if not the district. And so my kids would come into the class, I didn't know how to get them to focus. I wasn't sure what we should be spending our time on. Things were kind of hectic. And her kids were out in the courtyard lined up. Good morning, Mrs. Harrison. How are you boys and girls doing today? We're fine, Mrs. Harrison. How are you? Like perfect little angels. She would get them in her class. They would sit down. They knew exactly what to do. She's like, math group over here, reading group over here. Da, da, da. They were on point. And her kids were clearly there was going to be no achievement gap in Mrs. Harrison's class. And so, as you can imagine, as a first-year teacher who's struggling, it was awesome to hear that day after day as I struggled to get my kids to sit down and focus on me. After one particularly really hard lesson, I went over to Mrs. Harrison's class just to, say hello, because I just needed a little pep talk, and she asked me, she said, well, how are things going over there, Mrs. Baker? And being the crier that I am, I started to cry again, and she sort of discreetly went up and closed the door so no one would, walk by and see this broken down teacher who's supposed to be in charge of the class bawling. And she said, tell me what's going on. I just kind of poured my heart out to her, and, as, I was going to say luck would have it, but I guess as God would have it, she was actually a Christian, and she had heard me talk about looking for a church, and she asked me if she could pray with me. And just having that community of someone who would be willing to do that, there were no kids in the classroom, the doors were closed, it was all legal. But she did that with me, and it was so wonderful and so inspiring. But more than that, she started to talk to me really honestly about the things that I was like screwing up. She's like, okay, let's just, come, let me observe you. I'm going to get a teacher to stay with my class. I want to get in there and see what you're doing. And she gave me suggestion after suggestion, how to build relationships with my parents so they really knew that I was on the side of their kids and wasn't just going to call when I had something negative to say. How to set very ambitious goals for my students and to invest them in that. And she, gave me the great suggestion of, look, it's already November, you've lost a couple months basically, and your kids are far behind. You're going to need to bring them in for after-school tutoring and Saturday. Consider even bringing them to the library on Saturday. So, I found tutors from the church I was going to, the local community college, and we started this campaign basically to catch my kids up with a sense of urgency. And as a result, by the end of the year, through this army of people that we had really helping my kids and parents getting involved and families getting involved, my kids increased their reading and math about 2.5 grade levels that year. And that was, from sort of November through June. And for me, it was amazing because it wasn't that, we accomplished this and now I'm a phenomenal teacher. Like I had so much still to learn. But what I realized was my students have unlimited potential. Working that way and then the way that we worked that year is incredibly hard. But it taught me the lesson of it's completely possible. No one can ever convince me that kids from the poorest families can't read. I had kids coming into my class that year who were immigrating from Central America who didn't speak any English. There were no bilingual resources in my school. I had to find ways to help my kids get what they needed, but those kids were able to get there too. Maybe not as far as I wanted them to, but the potential is what I saw. And so the great news here is that it's not just one teacher in Compton who did this. There are thousands of teachers around the country who are seeing gains like that with their kids, who are saying, I don't care what anyone else says. I don't care if people are chattering and saying, oh, these kids can't do it. I'm going to do it anyway because I believe in my kids and I can get them to believe more in themselves and work with their families and come alongside each other and say, we can change this. There are schools all around the country that are seeing this not just in one classroom, but in entire schools. There are schools in some of the poorest communities that are seeing 100% of their kids graduate from high school and get accepted into top-notch colleges with scholarship money, defying the odds that anyone thought was possible. And again, the good news for me is that it's not just a couple of schools. It's happening, you all over the country. And so the challenge, though, is that we need many more schools and many more school districts to have that type of outcome. And to get there, we're going to need a lot of us to be involved in this. So the question, I think, for us as Christians is why should we care about this? I'm guessing many folks are sort of saying, yep, it makes sense, on board, get it, get why we should care about this. But I want to just take a couple of minutes here to just rest here for a moment and make the case. I run an organization now, the Expectations Project, and our mission is to mobilize communities of faith to tackle this issue and to really champion it as one of the biggest justice issues of our generation. So I think a lot about this, how to frame it and how to talk about it with Christians. So the first piece here is that, you all are talking a lot about justice on the campus here at Gordon and in classes, and for me that is sort of reason number one. God calls us to work for justice. The Bible, I think, is very clear about the importance of working to support the poor and the disenfranchised at every level, and to really work not just, as a professor and I talked about in his class yesterday, not just as an act of charity, but as an act of justice, to bring things that are unequal to be equal. And one of the verses that really spells that out for me pretty clearly is Isaiah 10, verse 1 and 2, first part of verse 2. How terrible it will be for those who make unfair laws and those who write laws that make life hard for people. They are not fair to the poor, and they rob my people of their rights. And, there's, I think, lots of discussion about, what education laws and education policies should look like, but I think we can all agree that the way the system is currently structured and the outcomes that we're seeing, there's something going on that's inherently unequal. And again, it's up for debate, I think, about, where are the root causes. I think there's lots of issues. There's sort of no, one answer. People often ask me that, like, what's the one thing? I'm like, oh, I wish there were one thing. There's not. But clearly there's something going on with the way we have the outcomes being demonstrated that we're having some serious inequalities. The second piece, I think, for why Christians should care is that God has such a heart for children. And, I think the Bible is, again, very clear about that. The way that Jesus talked about children, just the joy that he had to bring them to come and talk to him when others were saying, send them aside. There's something special and unique that we can learn and sort of have and receive from children. And I believe that that's, again, clear throughout the Bible and another reason we should focus on this issue. And finally, the Bible is very clear about the fact that every single person is made in God's image and likeness. And, I am not a theologian, I will not pretend to be, but the way I read that and the way that's been made real for me and in my heart is that every person on the planet that God creates has unlimited potential. I believe he gives us all different gifts and different callings, but the idea of a God who would give academic potential only to kids who live in suburban communities and not give it to kids in poor communities just makes no logical sense, I'm sure, to me or to anyone in here. And so if we follow that line of thinking, then we have to say, okay, well, these outcomes are not what a God who gives unlimited potential to all and doesn't discriminate with that. These outcomes for kids in low-income public schools are not what he would desire. And I believe that with them very deeply and very strongly. And so for me, these are sort of the three principles I keep in mind when thinking about why Christians should get involved in this particular issue. So what is it going to take for us to see change? The first thing I think we need to see is we need to have a mindset shift. I often talk about, the fact that I am, convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt, know it deep in my knower, as my pastor in college used to say. Don't know what the knower is, but he used to say it. But I think it's easy to say. It's kind of a platitude to say, of course, all children can learn. Like it's like a bumper sticker platitude to some extent, right? And I think truly believing it is a deep mindset shift, I think, for a lot of us. I certainly had to go through my own mindset shift as a teacher, even though I thought it in my head. The reality of kids who are far behind makes it something you have to really test yourself. Do I really believe that? And I would submit that in our country, if you really deep down ask, folks, and I don't mean anyone in here, of course, but the country in general, do we really think that all kids can achieve at high levels? And when I say all kids, I mean all kids. I mean the kid whose, parent is, in jail and they're growing up with their grandmother, the kid who just moved here who doesn't speak any English in the 3rd grade, the child who is growing up in abject poverty with, 10 or 12 family members in a 1 or 2 bedroom house. Like, do we think all of those kids can achieve? Or do we think their life circumstances are just too hard to overcome? Or there's something inherent in them or their family that doesn't value education so they can't get there? And trust me, I'm not going to say that it's not harder for kids with challenging circumstances to get there, but to think that it's not possible, that's a different issue. And I think the mindset of changing it, our way of thinking, especially as believers, as Christians, like we should be the ones saying, calling the things that are not as though they are. Like we should be the ones saying, like, yes, it's possible because we're people of faith, and so we're going to believe, and we're also going to work really hard to make it happen, but we're going to start by shifting our mindset. And then convincing others that this problem can be solved as well. So essentially, there's just a deep need for a change in public will and political will in order to really push the hard work, whether it's, funding that's required differently for public schools, the hard work of getting in there and working hard with kids and families every day. In order to want to do that and take those steps, we have to, I think, initially renew our minds about what's possible for kids. The final piece here on the mindset shift is that, honestly, the church really, in my opinion, shouldn't see ourselves as an organization and a body who can disengage from public schools. And I would love to say that we haven't, but we kind of have. Not all of us, but, when you look at the history of Christians engaging with public schools, we have some dirty little secrets, you all. A lot of Christian academies were started in the South during desegregation. That these academies, sprung up because there were people who didn't want their kids to go to school with African American or Latino kids. And so, that was sort of one dirty little secret. There's also just the idea that I believe some of us don't feel that because, prayer was taken out of schools or because we can't talk about God in schools, then we don't want to have any involvement because it's sort of just this secular entity that we think is just not welcoming to Christians. And look, I personally believe that everyone, as a parent, I fully believe this, everyone should send their kid where they want them to go to school, pick a private school, a Catholic school, a parochial school, home school, suburban, send your kids wherever you want. But for me, what is the responsibility that I have as a Christian to still care for those kids who are trapped in schools that are underperforming every day? Like that's really where I think the root of the issue is in terms of how we engage. I have a friend who works on public school partnerships in New York, and he told me this really fascinating story of a friend of his who's a principal of a school in the Bronx, in a very low-income community, and he was talking to his friend about, wouldn't it be great if we could get my organization to come alongside and partner with you all in your public school and, wrap around support for tutoring or praying for you all, donating supplies. And he looked at his friend and said, I don't think we want your help. And his friend was kind of shocked and said, why not? And he said, honestly, I've been working at this school for 20 years. I've only had Christians reach out to me 2 times. The first time was to protest any semblance of talking about homosexuality in the curriculum. And the second time was to protest not allowing prayer in school. And he said, you know what, I have my own opinions about those issues, and I respect your opinion about those issues, but he said, that's the only time you could come and talk to me about public schools. My kids can't read. They're dropping out of school. Their families are struggling. They need help every day. Shouldn't Christians be talking about those issues too? And, unfortunately, that's in some cases the reputation that I think we've been left with. And, again, no judgment or discussion about which issues we should be talking about with public education. I just want to see us have a much broader engagement with public schools and really looking at the disparity that I believe is a justice issue with public schools. We're going to need, to change this problem, we're going to need transformational and courageous change. We can tinker around the edges all day long. We've had the achievement gap for, 40 years, and we still have not seen it really disappear. And, the challenge I think that we're seeing now is that we want to sort of still take these small steps, and real change is courageous, it's transformational, and everyone's not going to love everything you do. And one of the things we're seeing now is that if we really want to engage sort of a holistic approach to improving public schools, we have to make sure that we're doing it with the communities where the achievement gap is most acute. And it's important, I think, for us as Christians, but really anyone who wants to get involved in this issue, to really view ourselves as partners in the effort, and partners with families and with parents and with kids and with teachers who are already working on this issue. And that's the way I think we really build the type of momentum to take on some of these very courageous and bold changes that are necessary. And, if anyone's following the sort of wonky education reform debate, it's incredibly controversial. I actually think it's really exciting because it's, I'd say it's very juicy and sort of like a little soap opera. There's just so much going on. And the challenge, I think, is for us to find something that we we as people of faith can really sink our teeth into that we think is going to move the ball forward for kids. Specifically, faith communities can do a few other things. We can serve as vision casters, is what I like to talk about for communities of faith. And that's really the idea that I mentioned earlier, the importance for us to really speak the truth and speak what's possible about kids and lift up examples of success. And we have lots of spheres of influence, students, the churches you go to, you talking to your parents who may go to churches of their own. We have lots of ways we can sort of get this message out there and become ambassadors for kids in low-income communities to talk about what's possible. Arm yourself with a couple of stories about success that you read about a school near you that was sort of defying the odds, and talk about those challenges, or talk about those successes when talking to folks about what's possible for kids in public schools. We have a friend who started a small group study in her church about public education and seeing this as a justice issue. And it started out as just a few people gathering together weekly to sort of delve into education issues in a biblical context. And it grew into this amazing group of people that are taking on education in their community. They've become tutors, they're supporting public education policy reforms, and it's really grown. But it started with one person who said, I want to talk to more people in my congregation about this. And that's someone who's, I think, really emblematic of what I would call a vision caster. The second thing, we can be laborers. As members of the faith community, there's a lot of work to be done. I think for all of us, if this is an issue that you feel like God is pricking your heart about, it may be your full-time job to go and teach in an urban community or a rural community. It may not be, and that's okay too, but there's just so many different ways that we can get involved. Simply praying for kids and for teachers and for families to get the academic success and academic supports that they need is hugely helpful. Wouldn't that be awesome if we're all taking the time to put that on our list of things to pray about? I think that would be fabulous. There are ways that churches can get involved and start partnerships. The church I go to in DC started a partnership with a public school, and it's just been phenomenal for all of us to see the outcomes. Another great story, which we probably can't all do this one, but a pastor of a really large church in Los Angeles ended up finding out about the achievement gap through discussions with folks, and he decided that he wanted to go and meet with the public school near them, and he literally went and said, hey, what do you all need? How can we help? And they were like, okay, we don't really know you, but if you want to help us, we need some computers. And he's like, okay. He went back to his church, and the next Sunday he took up an offering for the school, saying, this is what we want to do. We want to buy them some computers. They raised $50,000 for the school. Now, obviously, this was a very wealthy church. Lots of, I think, maybe Hollywood folks go there or something. I don't know, but people that could write really nice checks. And so they went back to the school and said, well, here, we have this money. We'd love to buy computers for you. And the principal and teachers were like, oh, we were sort of, thought you were kidding. Like, what's going on? And the teachers literally started to weep because they had never seen someone just come so humbly and say, what do you need? How can we help? And actually deliver on it. And so, of course, they started a much larger partnership with that school and has continued beyond supplying computers. The final way that we can get involved is to become advocates. There are a lot of ways we can get involved locally, which are incredibly important, but there are these broader systemic reforms that are necessary in public schools. The organization I work with, the Expectations Project, we are working in several cities, and one of them is Indianapolis. And one of the big issues we're mobilizing clergy and their congregations around is the need to get funded early childhood preschool for kids in Indianapolis public schools, because there's no public preschool right now, and it's a major issue to make sure kids are ready for kindergarten. And so we have all these clergy that are becoming educated about the need for the issue. They're going to talk to their state legislature members about this issue, letter writing campaigns, email campaigns, and we're starting to see this momentum among people of faith in Indianapolis around early childhood. And I really believe that we're going to be able to put a moral face on an issue that's incredibly important for kids, and I think it's going to be really helpful to bring change. For anyone who wants to know more about the Expectations Project, that's what we do. We're on Twitter because you have to be on Twitter now. @Expect Project, feel free to follow us. I think I kind of miss the social media stuff. I'm a little too old for it, but I have great staff members that are tweeting all the time, so they'd be happy to hear from you. I guess what I want to leave you all with is that one of my favorite quotes is this quote from Bonhoeffer, that the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that we leave our children. And right now, I would suggest that we're not probably leaving the world the way we want to for our kids, particularly with respect to public education. But I'm really looking to you as the next generation that's going to help say we're going to solve this problem in our lifetime, particularly as Christians. So thanks.